say bye-bye to the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year that was 2020. When we pause to remember all that's gone on this past year, it's overwhelming. We've had multiple pandemics. There's the virus itself, but there's also the economic devastation for millions of people and the mental health crisis that is looming from all of the isolation and chronic anxiety of so many. A lot of us lost loved ones this year, and we weren't able to be with them at the end. Nor could we gather physically with friends and family to help us through the grief. Then there were the greater than normal number of hurricanes, forest fires, and other natural and unnatural disasters that plagued us. And don't forget the ongoing killing of people of color, fueled by conscious or unconscious racism that seemed to have woken up more of us white folk than ever before to the reality that not all people are treated equally or equitably in our country. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the most contentious election I've witnessed in my entire lifetime, where the left and the right continued to demonize each other. Plus, we had to figure out how to do everything virtually: work, church, school, socializing, and that has taken up so much of our time and energy. And it seemed like every day we had to make difficult choices to balance our personal safety with the need to work or send children to school or to pick up groceries and so on. Thank goodness 2020 is behind us now. Except as we look forward to 2021, not much has changed. Much as we probably all hoped that when the calendar clicked over to 2021, we were owed an end to all the things that we put up with these last many months. But guess what? They're pretty much all still with us. COVID-19, racism, climate change, mental health challenges, an ever-widening divide between rich and poor, technology haves and have-nots, progressives and conservatives. Oh, there's a vaccine now, which is lifting our spirits a bit. But in the midst of that glimmer of good news, coronavirus continues to sicken and kill an unimaginable number of people around the world. In the US alone, the number of people killed in 9/11 are dying every single day. And we are coming to grips with the fact that it's still going to be a while before we can continue returning to some semblance of a new normal. And we're not sure what that normal is going to look like. Into this ongoing pain and tragedy and challenge, I'm grateful for the readings of the church year that ground us. In today's first lesson, we hear from the prophet Jeremiah, who speaks for God. First, a brief history lesson. The Israelites, God's people, had a series of kings, starting with Saul and David and Solomon. And when Solomon died, there was a battle over who would take the throne. Finally, the kingdom split in two, and there was the northern kingdom, Israel, and a southern kingdom, Judah, with its capital, Jerusalem, and the temple of God. And over many years, the two kingdoms had a series of kings, and some of them were better than others. But all of these kings trusted in their own military and political power more than they trusted in God. And they forgot their call to care for the poor and the stranger. So God sent prophets to the people to remind them of who and whose they were and what their call was. Jeremiah was one of those prophets who was sent to the southern kingdom of Judah. He had a long career, starting with warning the Israelites to return to God or there would be catastrophe. But the people, particularly the leaders, didn't listen to Jeremiah or any of the other prophets. And so first, the northern kingdom was invaded by the Assyrians. Then the southern kingdom was invaded by the Babylonians, who destroyed the temple and pillaged their beloved Jerusalem. Their leaders were hauled off to Babylon, where the ones who survived the brutal 700-mile hike through the desert to their new home were subjected to foreign leaders, a foreign language, and foreign customs. The many others who were left in Judah lacked food or work, and many walked hundreds of miles the other way to Egypt just to survive. The Israelites remained in exile for many years as strangers in strange lands, subject to the cruelty and oppression of their rulers, and without their beloved temple. How would they worship? It seemed like they had been abandoned by God. But the prophet Jeremiah remained with them. He wept with them in their loss and struggle. And he urged them to settle down, to have families, and to try to adapt to their new situation. And in today's reading, Jeremiah offers the people a message of hope from God. He says that life will not always be like this. God promises to redeem their pain and to gather them together. Jeremiah tells them that even though they now feel dry and wilted, God will transform them into a beautiful, well-watered garden. God promises them that one day their suffering and their mourning will end and they will sing with joy. These are beautiful images of God's tender care for God's people in the midst of their pain and suffering, and of the transformation that God promises them. It seems like the more things change, the more they remain the same. Here we are today, in many ways not unlike our adopted ancestors, the Israelites. And in times like this, don't we sometimes ask ourselves, has God abandoned us? Where is God in all this? In this season of Christmas, these scriptures we hear today remind us that God never abandons God's people. In the midst of all that's going on, when things look hopeless, God comes to us. Not as a military warrior or a powerful political leader who promises to make us great again, but as the Word made flesh, living among us, full of grace and truth, as we hear in today's gospel. This Word lives among you and me, among our families and friends, among the frontline workers in healthcare and food supply. This Word lives among the poor and the sick and the dying, and the lost and forgotten. This Word lives among the refugees and asylum seekers, the prisoners and the outcasts. There is nowhere that this living Word is not. In the midst of the world's pain and sadness, this is the promise of Christmas. God is with us, and so the darkness never has the last word. The light of Christ shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not ultimately win. When we gather together each week, whether in person or online, we proclaim and celebrate this reality. My favorite part of the Christmas Eve service is when we light our candles and pass the light of Christ from one person to another. This year, many of us did this in our own homes as we were connected through cyberspace. This is a visual reminder that the light of Christ is in each one of us, and that God transforms and connects us through Jesus Christ. Our declaration of purpose as the Southwestern Texas Synod is that God's grace transforms and connects us to learn, to love, to lead. God's grace transforms and connects us for a purpose. When God claimed us in baptism, we became part of God's family, just like the Israelites when God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. And like the Israelites, and like John from today's gospel, our purpose is to testify in word and deed to the love and faithfulness of God and of God's gracious intention for all of creation. In the midst of this pandemic, I have witnessed you doing this. Through worshiping in new ways you would have thought impossible 10 months ago. You have done this through feeding hungry people and reaching out to those who are shut in. Our chaplains have done this in hospitals and nursing homes and on battlefields. You have done this by learning about racism and how to combat it for the sake of our siblings of color. You have witnessed to the light of the world by joining the Texas Border Collaboration Network to provide hope and care for those who continue to cross our borders, looking for wholeness. You continue to witness to the faithfulness of God through your generous giving to your local congregations and other organizations like Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, Lutheran Disaster Response, and more. You bring the light of Christ to one another as you gather within or across congregations online for conversation and consolation, and to resource one another to learn, to love, and to lead in new ways. And God's church is being transformed and connected in the process. In the midst of our weariness and loneliness, in the midst of our frustration over how long all of this is going on, God has come and continues to come to and through us. Emmanuel, God is with us. May we keep sharing that good news, bearing the light of Christ with a world that so desperately needs it. Blessed New Year to you all. Amen.